In 2018, the Nintendo Switch, a multi-billion-dollar portable fortress, was opened by a 5-cent metal paperclip. Not in a lab demo that never left a forum, on consoles that were already on store shelves under Christmas trees and in living rooms. In March 2017, Nintendo launched what looked like a masterpiece, the Nintendo Switch. Engineered as a portable fortress, a hybrid console meant to end an era of piracy the company could never quite kill. It was designed from the ground up to wipe out the ghosts of Nintendo's past, the mod chips, the custom firmware, the homebrew channels that had dismantled the Wii and the Nintendo DS. This time, Nintendo wasn't playing around. They built a modern, encrypted, sandboxed ecosystem, the kind of architecture that makes executives sleep at night. But the thing that brought that fortress to its knees was not a sophisticated cyber attack by a nation-state. It was not an elite team of underground software engineers pulling off a multi-million-dollar digital heist. It was a standard 5-cent metal paperclip. No software bypass, no network exploit, no 0 days sold in a dark market. Just a piece of twisted office wire slid down a plastic controller rail. And the most terrifying part for Nintendo, they could not patch it. No firmware update, no emergency code drop, no software wall could ever seal the hole. Because Nintendo hadn't only made a mistake in code, they had manufactured the defect into silicon, into millions of devices already on retail shelves and in living rooms worldwide. They had minted their own vulnerability. If you want the full chain, from a panic in 2016 to a chip bought for speed, to a factory backdoor, to a paperclip that still works on the right hardware, stay with this. We're going to follow the ground truth of the machine, not the marketing. If that already sounds like your kind of story, hit subscribe. We tear down the exploits that rewrote hardware history, and this one rewrote a console's soul with office supplies. Now we step inside the hardware, into the multi-billion-dollar gamble that started it all. To understand why the Switch fell so spectacularly, go back to the corporate panic of 2016. Nintendo was backed into a corner. Their previous console, the Wii U, had been a catastrophic commercial disaster, alienating third-party developers, confusing the public, and selling just over 13 million units across its entire life. For context, the original Wii had sold over 100 million. While Nintendo struggled, Sony's PlayStation 4 was dominating the living room. Nintendo's reserves were draining. Their reputation as a hardware titan rode on one bet: a hybrid machine codenamed NX, the console that would become the Switch. They needed to design, test, manufacture, and ship revolutionary hardware in record time. But custom processors don't appear on a schedule. Building a chip from scratch burns years of prototypes and billions in R&D. So, Nintendo made a high-stakes gamble. Instead of engineering the brain of the machine in-house, they decided to outsource it. They turned to Silicon Valley and bought an off-the-shelf system on a chip from Nvidia, the Tegra X1. On paper, it was brilliant, powerful for its size, efficient, already shipping in Nvidia's own Android TV and tablet products. By using existing silicon, Nintendo skipped years of development, cut cost, and locked a path to the March 2017 launch window. But off-the-shelf parts come with off-the-shelf realities. The Tegra X1 was not a bespoke fortress chip carved only for Nintendo's security model. It was a general-purpose processor built to be flexible. And buried in that flexibility was a blind spot, a factory-era loophole Nintendo's rush would help turn into a permanent scar. Remember that choice. Everything that follows, the BootROM, the recovery mode, the paperclip, is downstream of buying someone else's brain and someone else's bugs to win a calendar. Every processor on Earth needs a starting point. The microsecond you press power, electricity hits the chip and something has to know what to do first. It can't read your operating system yet. Storage isn't ready. System memory isn't initialized. The machine is awake but blind.
So chip makers etch a tiny, fundamental program into the physical wiring of the silicon itself. That program is the BootROM, the primeval DNA of the console. It wakes before anything else, runs raw hardware instructions, and performs basic cryptographic checks so the software about to load looks genuine, unaltered, and signed by the people who own the platform. Because that code is burned into read-only gates at the factory, it is permanent. It cannot be rewritten with an update. No download, no emergency patch, no please install this firmware can edit a single line of true BootROM. If there is a mistake in that code, the mistake lasts for the physical life of the chip. And inside Nvidia's BootROM architecture sat a devastating loophole. To keep the chip serviceable, Nvidia built an emergency backdoor for factory technicians, a way to resurrect a bricked unit, diagnose it, dump memory, and bring dead silicon back to life. On the Tegra X1, that protocol was called USB Recovery Mode, RCM. Force the chip into RCM and it bypasses the normal operating system and waits for a payload over a physical USB cable. Nvidia was not naive. They knew attackers would try to abuse recovery mode to run their own code, so they sealed the backdoor with cryptography. The BootROM was supposed to read the incoming payload, check it against Nvidia's master signing key, and reject anything that wasn't properly signed. It was an industrial-grade gate. Then the programmers made a first-year computer science mistake in how that gate handled size. The castle had a service entrance. The lock on that entrance trusted a number, and the number could lie.
To see the mistake, look at how a machine handles short-term memory. When a payload arrives in recovery mode, the Tegra copies the data into a temporary region of memory, a buffer. Before it copies, the BootROM asks a simple question: how large is this file? A correct program reads that size, checks it against the buffer, and refuses anything that does not fit. In the Tegra X1 BootROM, that length check was broken. Researchers found that a carefully crafted packet could lie about its length, claim an absurd size, and the BootROM would believe it. It would keep copying, byte by byte, past the end of the buffer. This is a classic buffer overflow. Imagine pouring a gallon of water into a teacup. The cup doesn't hold the gallon. The table gets the rest. In silicon, the spill overwrites neighboring memory, including critical control data on the execution stack. By arranging the overflow with precision, attackers didn't merely crash the chip, they rewrote what the processor would do next, in real time. They forced it to skip the cryptographic signature check entirely. The security gate was not picked, it was drowned. The moment the buffer overflowed, the chip stopped asking Nintendo or Nvidia for permission. It executed whatever came next with unrestricted kernel-level control of the machine. There was still a physical roadblock. To run the overflow, you first had to force the chip into RCM. On a retail switch in a living room, there is no friendly recovery mode button on the shell. Nintendo had buried the hardware triggers deep in the architecture. The back door was unlocked in silicon, but nobody could reach the handle. Until someone looked down the right-hand controller rail. To make the Switch a modular hybrid, Nintendo designed Joy-Con controllers that slide onto rails on either side of the screen. At the bottom of the right rail sits a strip of 10 golden pins, power, data, and signals between console and controller. Independent researchers and hardware hackers, including the collective known as Failoverflow, began testing those pins one by one. They used logic analyzers, mapped voltages, and traced lines into the motherboard. Then they hit gold. Pin 10, the last pin on the inside of the right rail, tied into a grounding line on the Tegra X1. Nvidia's own documentation described the behavior. If that ground line was held low during a cold boot, power on from a fully off state, the chip would leave its normal boot path. It would behave as if it sat on a factory diagnostics bench and drop straight into USB recovery mode. The recipe became almost insultingly simple. Bridge pin 10 to ground, hold volume up, press power.
The barrier was no longer math, it was a physical gap measured in millimeters of empty air between contacts. The underground raced to build the cheapest, simplest jig that could close that gap. Some opened Joy-Cons and soldered microswitches inside. Some wrapped kitchen tinfoil at the bottom of the rail. Some printed plastic jigs holding a sliver of copper wire. The method that went legendary was the dumbest in the best way, a household paperclip straightened and bent into a sharp U. You slide it down the right rail until the metal bridges pin 10 to the grounded chassis of the rail. Hold volume up, press power. The switch screen stays black. To anyone else in the room, it looks dead. Plug USB-C into a laptop and the machine announces itself. Nvidia Recovery, the fortress answering a paperclip. A multi-billion-dollar portable fortress opened by Office Stationery. That is the image that should stick. Not a hacker in a hoodie montage, a bent wire in a plastic groove, and a black screen that is lying about being off.
In April 2018, researchers released the exploit publicly under the name Fusée Gelée, French for frozen rocket. In Kyoto, the panic was not only that the switch could be hacked, it was that the vulnerability lived where software could not follow. Normally, when attackers find a bug in an operating system, the manufacturer ships a patch, pushes firmware, and closes the loop overnight. Cat and mouse favors the company that owns the update pipe. With Fusée Gelée, that hammer was useless. The flaw lived in the physical, read-only silicon gates of the Nvidia chip. A software update could not rewrite it. Full stop. Firmware 5, 8, 11 accept every prompt Nintendo sent, and the paperclip path still woke first. The exploit runs at the first microsecond of power on, overflowing the buffer before Nintendo's OS finishes waking up. Custom code can then patch the system in memory as it loads, stripping security layers before they ever harden. On the order of 15 million switches already built and distributed were permanently exposed on that generation of silicon. Nintendo had spent years building a secure platform and years manufacturing a flaw they could not recall with a download. The only real fix was logistical violence, redesign fabrication with Nvidia, change the silicon itself, restart the factory story. That revision, internally known as Mariko, removed the vulnerable BootROM behavior from new chips. The result was a permanent dividing line in the community. Early units are still called V1 unpatched, machines whose security story ends at a paperclip width gap. They remain prized on the secondary market, permanently open to homebrew, custom systems, and research tools that need nothing more exotic than a physical bridge. Software security is a conversation. BootROM security is a scar. Mariko closed the factory door for new units. It could not unscar the ones already sold.
Nintendo built an incredible digital castle and forgot that a castle is only as strong as the ground under it. By outsourcing the core processor to save time and money, they inherited a vulnerability they did not design and could not patch. They trusted a third-party chip. A factory recovery path plus a first-year length check bug turned a flagship fortress into a playground for anyone who could reach a rail. In high-stakes tech, complexity is often the enemy of security. The most sophisticated cryptographic walls mean nothing if you can walk up to the hinge, slide in 5 cents of wire, and tell the gate to open. If this breakdown earned a place in your brain, leave a like and tell me in the comments which fortress we should open next. Another console, another chip, another unhackable product that forgot the physical world. Subscribe if you want these forensic teardowns when they drop. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one, preferably before someone invents a cheaper key than a paperclip.